Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Geopolitical Cousins. Marco and I decided to put together an emergency podcast on the things that are happening in markets. I didn't have my normal microphone with me. Marco's internet was in and out, so this may not be the level of quality that you're used to from the audio, but we thought the content was good enough to push it out to you anyway. Hope you enjoy it. Email me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com. Any thoughts, questions, comments, etc. Otherwise, hope you're doing well out there. Take care. All right, Marco, I know we just did an emergency podcast, and I haven't even told you this, Marco. I put that funny comment that you had as the title of our last emergency podcast, which was only Friday, riding on the hog of a fiscal orgy. I've gotten more email commentary on the title of that podcast than almost any other episode I've put out in almost 10 years of doing podcasting. So
Wow.
kudos to you. And you're going to have to come up with another phrase for this one. But I know that we promised not to talk about markets, but here's how I'm going to segue into us actually talking about markets, because I was at my daughter's daycare this morning. I was the guest reader to read a book to the entire 12 kid class. Try reading a book to 12 two-year-olds, by the way. It's a really interesting experience. Anyway, while I was after I was reading, I was playing with my daughter, building blocks with castles, and her daycare teacher came up to me and said, "So Jacob, what are you thinking about markets? What's going on? I'm watching my investment, like things are not going particularly well." Which is to say, if my daughter's daycare teacher is asking me about markets, I think everybody's thinking about markets. So now is the time to actually talk about them. What do you think?
I think that it comes down to whether, tariffs are here to stay, whether President Trump wants to pursue a policy line of what I would call neo-McKinleyism, referring back to the late 19th century where President McKinley managed to basically finance most of the government through tariffs. And the reason that is impossible mathematically is because in the late 19th century, the US government was 2% of GDP. It's like 20 times more right now. Actually less than 20, but like 15. And that's a problem because, you could have financed the US government with a bake sale in the late 19th century. You can't really do that today. So that's one, like these tariffs are here to stay, maybe with slight variations over the next 6 months. In that case, I think there's more room for markets to correct. I think we go on the S&P 500 probably to the low 4,000. On the other hand, if they start pivoting towards negotiations and start flagging that as the end goal, then I think that we're in a different scenario. And that's why what I would say is that the most important thing to track right now is our countries getting punished or rewarded based on how they retaliate or not retaliate. So that's one thing to watch. For example, Vietnam, Taiwan, I think Israel. Those are the countries that have kind of come out and just like said, we're going to lower tariffs on U.S. imports. If like President Trump bites on that, it's significant because the U.S. doesn't really care about these export markets for the most part. So if he considers it a concession, that would be somewhat of a big deal. And then on the other hand, I think that we also need to watch whether or not President Trump starts feeling like he is almost hemmed in by the chaos itself. And what I mean by that is I think you posted something on X. I saw like how the off ramps, there's fewer and fewer off ramps. And it was funny because I was driving yesterday and I was thinking of the same analogy. That's why we're cousins. And that's why maybe we sometimes have groupthink. But I think that there's like two off ramps coming up. One is in 2 days, April 9th. And then there's another one right after that, like when the market melts down a little bit more, right? So there's quick off ramps. Like there's two quick off ramps right away. Like, oh, psych, just kidding. Like, yes, we do want to negotiate. The 10% stays, but we'll negotiate everything else. The other one, the next off ramp is like 150 miles away. And President Trump, if he doesn't take the next two off ramps, then he's going to drive 160 miles an hour to get to the next one. In other words, like he's got to start pivoting quickly. Otherwise, the recession itself, the pain, the criticism will, knowing what we know about President Trump, embolden him to just triple down. I mean, we're going to have our drink bleach moment of the trade war, right? When you triple down on like, no, everything is fine. Just gurgle some bleach. You're going to be good with it. And by the way, I say that as somebody who has said before, I would have probably been canceled during COVID. So it's not like I'm an anti-Trumper or something. But during the pandemic, that was like peak, like everything is fine. I'm just whistling past the graveyard. So one thing though that I just want to recount from our other emergency pod, I mentioned that I went to sleep thinking like, oh my God, he set tariffs so high. Who's going to negotiate? Everyone's going to retaliate. And many people in our industry have said the same thing. Like the risk here is retaliation and then re-retaliation. We saw that with China, right? He now wants to impose more tariffs, but nobody retaliated other than like America's sworn enemy, China. Like, okay, fine, China retaliated, but like,
China. Yeah.
yeah, like what Canada a little bit, with car tariffs. I mean, Canada was retaliating to tariffs imposed or announced a month ago, so whatever, who cares? But like, other than China, like, I'm actually sitting here saying to myself again to try to like really give Trump credit, and I know that's difficult right now. Both liberals and rich Trump fans hate him, right? So if you're in finance, if you're loaded, you hate Trump because he just destroyed your portfolio. If you're liberal, you've always hated Trump. So it's very difficult to find ways to defend him. But like to defend Trump, he imposed this ridiculously high tariff based on sixth grade math or AI. And yet it appears like the price was not too high for other countries. They're all willing to negotiate. And so that's why I think it's difficult to say whether he is not negotiating. I think every piece of information we get from him or the White House or his cabinet members is non-diagnostic. It cannot be used to falsify either one of these hypotheses.
I think you're exactly right that there's an off ramp on April 9th. But my concern is that if he doesn't take the off ramp on April 9th, that things could get really grim really quickly, and that it's going to create sort of a self-inducing spiral where even if he takes an additional off ramp, he's not going to be able to fix the situation because people are just going to be, oh, we can't trust the United States. Global trade is going to decline, a global deflationary spiral, the whole sort of Great Depression type scenario, which is why, one of the big, I don't know if it was a signal or not this morning, but there was that, I forget what his name was, Kevin Hassett or something like that, the National Economic Council, who said that there was a potential 90-day, pause where there could be negotiations. And then the White House came out and said, absolutely not. We're not doing that at all. Like, this is fake news. And he has since like deleted that social media post. So is that them like not wanting anybody to think that, but that's really what the plan has been the entire time? Because if that's the plan, to your point, like, okay, like they're in the right position. But if they speed past at 160 miles an hour, April 9th, I worry that the ball is going to be out of their court. Like, even if they want to pull it back in, they're not going to be able to at that point.
I agree with you. I mean, like, there's obviously a risk of that. And also negotiating trade deals is very difficult, as we talked about, last time. So it would have to be, I mean, and that ultimately is the danger, right? Because he can reverse a lot of things. He can reverse anything. It's very rare that we have a recession that's induced by like policy. Other than monetary policy, like when the central bank raises rates, for example. In which case, usually that recession was probably coming anyways. Borrowing rates go up, and you get a slowdown. But this time around, this is a policy that could be reversed, but it would have to be a pretty epic walkback. Did you see that American Enterprise Institute, which of course is a conservative think tank, came out and said like the calculation was wrong for the tariffs? I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I just see that.
It was just like the math was, and yeah, I mean, potentially. Again, I think what's fascinating here are two things. One, only two countries balked, or actually only one country balked at the ridiculousness of tariffs. And that's a sign that they didn't necessarily think they were ridiculous. I don't think that they think they're fair, but they're saying like, okay, we've got an anti-establishment leader in the US. He set a price really, really high. Let's go talk to him. And again, I find that fascinating, and I think it's important. And I think that President Trump is going to be encouraged in a good way towards negotiations, I think. Well, I hope. The problem is that if those negotiations don't lead to some sort of a political win for him, then he will triple down, and then he will tell everyone to proverbially drink bleach. And then we're going to have a pretty significant recession. And it's very difficult to see the path forward. In my investment strategy, I closed off all of my bullish risk-on trades literally the day before. There were a few, and thank God for that. But I did not expect the tariffs to be set this high. I actually thought that there was a pretty good chance that it would be like a dovish tariff announcement. I just didn't really have high conviction to put on any recommendations for my clients based on that sort of a scenario. It was a pretty low conviction view and a low probability scenario. But I did think he could surprise and then just use those tariffs to negotiate, FDI into the U.S., factories moving to the Midwest, the kind of things that he promised. Now, I think we should talk about why this is bad for the US. I think that there is this notion that, this is mostly bad for the rest of the world. And it's based on this idea that the US doesn't really export that much as percent of GDP. The rest of the world exports more to the US. So I think that there's really three constraints we should kind of think about. First of all, a lot of the stuff that America is actually pretty good at building, like capex, defense exports, so defense companies, defense like weapons, basically defense systems, and also airplanes. A lot of those things are procured by governments. So a lot of like state-owned entities, or essentially national champions, like an airline that's like private, but the government still owns some percent. Um, the stuff that America really sells in bulk is oftentimes bought by other governments. And so, like, if President Trump is serious about his tariffs, he's effectively, you know, he's effectively prioritizing the job of a theoretical manufacturing worker in Ohio over an actual real manufacturing worker in Washington State. Like, because the guy in Washington State building Boeings is out of a job tomorrow. So this would be my number one thing. And, already there was a Reuters article, for example, that said that U.S. defense companies and manufacturers were complaining to the U.S. government that the European defense rearmament, which President Trump has effectively, claimed as his victory, that it's not going to involve that much U.S. defense weapons and systems. And it's like, yeah, no shit. Like, it's going to involve no U.S. systems or weapons because you just launched a trade war against your allies. So that's the first thing I would say. Like, there's an immediate and very sharp and targeted. So if you're a senator from Washington, or if you're a representative from Washington State, as an example, like, you're probably freaking out. The second issue is farmers. And I'm going to let you cook on this one because you know this one better than everyone else. From what I understand, soft prices have been pretty weak for a long time for a number of different reasons, especially in fruits and sort of non-grains. And so you have a swath of Republicans in the House who represent these kind of very successful mid-sized to large American farmers who almost exclusively trade with Asia. So unless we all suddenly become obsessed with eating pears, I mean, honestly, Jacob, I don't remember the last time I had a pear. I don't know about you. Like, what's going to happen to Eastern Washington, to Idaho, to Oregon? And now we're not talking about like Portland and like Seattle. We're talking like the part of Washington and Oregon that vote Republican, as an example, in the House of Representatives. So please, you're infinitely more knowledgeable about agriculture and ags and all that stuff. So you tell me how that plays out in middle of America where this kind of stuff matters. And we saw, by the way, Iowa's, of course, Grassley and Kansas senators basically put another resolution trying to curb tariff authority from the president.
Yeah, I mean, the farmers in the energy complex are in the same boat here because the front line of the American economy that's going to feel the pain are the commodity exporters. So that can be your food commodities, that can also be your energy commodities. And I think you're seeing like a lot of fear and pain in both of those sectors. The agricultural community is interesting because they have faith in President Trump, and I think they still have relative faith in President Trump, even though the U.S. agricultural export complex has been the way that farmers are supposed to make money for over 100 years. And you had actually President Trump in that State of the Union back in January saying, well, maybe we need to consume more locally. But this really gets, Marko, to why I'm less certain that he's going to walk things back, or at least why I'm trying to check myself. Because I think one of the big problems with what we do, or with what geopolitics does, is that it assumes at some level rational actor theory. Like, it assumes that an actor is going to be rational or has some sense of what is wrong and some sense of what is going to shoot them in the foot. And all of these different things that Trump is doing, like, they just seem so obviously to me like they're going to be disastrous that I think, well, he can't possibly want to go down this route, because if he goes down this route, he is going to create this kind of depressionary cycle where, yes, the farmers are going to be hit and the energy exporters are going to be hit. And we're going to go from inflation to deflation quicker than you can think. And there's not going to be any kind of way to sort of stimulate things. And yet he is sort of doubling down on some of these things. And the other thing about this is the way that he has rolled out the tariff policy makes no fucking sense. Like, you can make an entire argument that protectionist US policy is better for the American farmer, for the energy producer, for the economy in general, and that if you roll it out in a thoughtful way with percentages that are actually calculated in a mathematical way that the AEI can defend and things like that, and with some advance notice to the allies that you're going to need, whether it's Mexico or Vietnam, to pull all of this off. But that's not what he did. He did this kind of Bush League, chat GPT. Oh, here's some tariffs and here's some tariffs for you. I'm going to do it and I'm not going to do it. It's been 3 months of yes, no, all over the place, which makes me think, is there any rational actor theory? Is he really out there thinking that there is some kind of plan? It makes no sense. And that the haphazard way that all of this has been rolled out sort of makes the tactics matter more than the strategy, because you can make an argument that the strategy makes sense as part of a broader plan, whether it's Mirren's plan or Besant's plan or any of these other things. But the way he's doing it is creating all of these different sort of counter reactions. And if he really does double down on the tariffs, then we get into Great Depression land. And if he doesn't double down on the tariffs, he's already sort of, to your point, like cast the die with some of these powers. The EU defense thing you talked about, that's a couple weeks old now. But I did my little watch officery stuff over the weekend. And one of the biggest stories that I think didn't make it top of the fold, but which stood out to me, was that the EU has already reached out to India to eliminate tariffs on car imports, and that India is responding favorably to doing that as part of a deal to seal longstanding free trade talks that they've been pussyfooting around for a decade. So if you just moved India and the EU to a free trade deal by doing this framed poster of these really like poorly calculated tariffs, like, doesn't matter if you take the off ramp, you've already like screwed the world into turning its back on you.
Look, the third constraint, which is this all leads to, is exactly this point that like President Trump is fighting a war with the rest of the world. The rest of the world is not fighting a war against the US. And that is going to lead to a lot of problems. But that makes me think of something else. The rest of the world has room to stimulate their economies. We don't at all. In fact, the borrowing rate in the US has not come down. It's actually dangerously high. So for those of you who are not in finance and who are just listening to this for entertainment, this is a really important point. In developed markets, like markets that work well, that have independent central banks and coherent policymakers, when there's a recession, borrowing rates come down. Yes, the central bank cuts rates, but also investors just buy bonds, which brings down the cost of borrowing. Okay, like in nebulous sort of terms. It doesn't matter. Just trust me on this. This is not happening this time around. This is like the first recession in the US, potentially if we have one, in 40, 50 years, where the long end of the curve, like the long dated borrowing rates, which matter for your mortgage payments, for example, if you have a variable mortgage rate, they're basically staying high and elevated. So the US doesn't really have room to fiscally stimulate. The rest of the world does. And so President Trump is forcing the rest of the world to grow faster. But because he's also shot himself in the foot, they're not going to buy American goods. They're going to buy each other's goods. So he's accelerating and like in a vicious circle kind of way, the move of capital and growth out of the US. And I think that's really important. And that goes back to why this is happening. Jacob, like since 2008, since the great financial crisis, income inequality has been a big deal to the US. We had 2 terms of Barack Obama for various reasons, including Republican opposition, but also perhaps lack of imagination of the Democrats. We didn't solve that income inequality. We had low growth, low inflation. We got Trump in 2016. Trump immediately started with fiscal stimulus. He was like, I can do whatever I want, and the Tea Party didn't prevent it. So we had stimulus. Then we had the pandemic, and then the Democrats joined President Trump in an orgy of fiscal stimulus, which we talked about last podcast. But all of this has kind of run out and hasn't actually kind of really improved the lives of, voters who are still mad. And so now we've decided to say, you know what? It wasn't fiscal. We can't do it anymore. That's out. we're just going to blame the rest of the world for this. Is the fault of the rest of the world. And so what we're going to do is insulate ourselves, and that's going to somehow magically solve income inequality. But instead, what it's going to do is it's going to force everyone out there who was kind of riding on American fiscal policy to do their own. They're going to start doing free trade agreements with themselves. They're going to start fixing domestic economies. Europe is going to structurally change some things domestically, integrate further. Canada's going to do the same. And the US is going to miss out on that global growth over the next 5 years. So this isn't just about like prices of your, toaster ovens going up or t-shirts. This is also about the fact that the US is going to rebalance growth by being mean to everyone else.
Yeah, the wealth inequality point is important, and I actually used to start all of my presentations when I was talking about the United States with a chart of wealth inequality going back towards the Great Depression, and I stopped doing that towards the end of the Trump presidency because it actually started to go down a little bit. Now it was still at blown out levels that we haven't seen since like the 1920s and 1930s, but towards the end of I think I have this right, towards the end of the Trump administration and into the Biden administration, wealth inequality started to narrow in the United States for the first time in decades. And things were actually getting incrementally better, which also, if you look at some of the data and statistics on manufacturing spending in the United States or investment in like manufacturing, like, things were actually going well under the Biden administration. Like the United States was kind of on the path that maybe the Trump administration wanted it to be on, not completely, but at least in some ways it seemed to be making progress. But I'm glad you brought up the point about rates, because another thing that the listener should know is when you do pick a trade war like this, you expect also, sort of two things to happen, right? Yields to go down and for the dollar to strengthen.
Right.
Or no, the dollar, the dollar weaken, excuse me, right?
Oh,
We expect
right. No. You're right. Yes, everybody rushes into the US because it's a safe haven. You're absolutely right. And because everybody rushes into the US and buys American bonds, borrowing rates in America come down, yields come down, and at the same time, the dollar goes up. So that's exactly what should be happening. People should not be selling their holdings of US treasuries. Like, okay, maybe somebody like an Asian owner of equity of bonds might have to liquidate them to like be in cash or something like that, to finance their margin calls. But almost 99 out of 100 recessions, the dollar goes up. And part of the reason is that there's a safe haven flow into the US. Everybody repatriates into the US. American investors do the same. And there's a rush to the ultimate safe haven asset, which is the US Treasury. Why is the US Treasury the safe haven asset? Well, many reasons. One of them being that the United States of America is a magnanimous hegemon that allows you to sell your goods into the US. I mean, that's, so this is all connected, and they're basically undermining this very like reality. Like America as a safe haven in a global recession is being undermined by the policies that they're pursuing. So you're absolutely right. The dollar like weakening in a recession is another very weird, strange phenomenon. Now I can explain that without geopolitics, by the way. This happened in 2001. It's the last recession we had where the dollar rallied before the recession, then was kind of flat and then fell for the next couple of years. That can happen as well. But yeah, I would say that this is very weird what's going on right now, Jacob. And I think that if you're just sitting at home and you're thinking like Trump's policies are going to hurt you because some exporter might have to fire people or because your prices are going to go up, like what's actually happening under the waves, under the tsunami waves of this policy is actually even worse. The current is taking capital out of the US and will take it. And part of the reason is that US has put a gun to everyone else and it has no bullets in that gun. What do I mean by that? US spent bullets after the pandemic on just making its people happy because it doesn't know how to solve income inequality. The rest of the world never spent those bullets. Let me say that again. The rest of the world did not stimulate even close to how much the US did. So for the rest of the world, they saved their bullets. And a lot of American investors, sophisticated ones, by the way, are completely misinformed on this point. They think, oh, well, France is in the same boat as we are. Yeah, but Germany isn't. The EU as a whole isn't. They can just issue EU bonds that will yield as much as German ones. And by the way, the Chinese 10-year yield is the lowest it is of any major economy. So the rest of the world saved their bullets. I mean, I don't know why they did, but they did. Probably because they had automatic stabilizer and because their income inequality problems were not as high, whereas in America they are. So the US hosed its population down with an orgy of fiscal stimulus. The rest of the world saved the bullets. And now they have them to respond to this exogenous effect, which, and by the way, this is the other thing, Jacob. Can you convince a conservative in the House of Representatives that they need to now blow fiscal policy again? They're going to say, but wait a minute, we're doing this to ourselves, okay? Whereas in Europe or China, they just got invaded by aliens, as far as they're concerned, right? Like this is from the like Trump is being mean to me. Hey, I got to respond. And so this growth reorientation, not to mention all the structural reform the rest of the world is going to do to compete with America, and not to mention all the ways that America will actually impede its ability to compete with the rest of the world by just like sticking its head in the sand. I mean, it's going to cause a much more significant impact on your life if you're listening to this than just the cost of your toaster oven going up. I think it's going to also make it more difficult for you to travel because the dollar could be 30% cheaper over the next 2 years. So if you want to go on vacation, book it right now. Book that Caribbean vacation right now while it's still, the US dollar is still as high as it is.
Do you think that's true if he takes the off ramp on April 9th?
Yes.
Like everything you said, is it already baked in or is there an off ramp to what you just talked about?
No, I honestly think if Kamala Harris had won, it would have been the same. So I don't want to I think what Trump is doing, he's just accelerating it. But there is an additional problem. There is an additional, I think a lot of things we overemphasize personalities. You know this, Jacob. Like you and I might differ a little bit here. I'm more of a structuralist, whatever, Marxist, material dialectic. Humans don't matter. But I do think that there is an element here of just insane policymaking. So if you really did use the ChatGPT app to calculate your tariff, bro, there's reasons why, it's a problem. It's a problem because again, the pillar of American awesomeness is regular process, due process, reasonable arguments. Not saying the rest of the world is raping us, which is literally what the president of the United States of America said. Europe put 10% tariffs on American cars. It's unfair. They should be punished for that. But it's not rape, okay? It's not. Just go up to Brussels.
And it doesn't mean that you should go put a 40% tariff on an uninhabited island with just penguins and have your guys out there talking about, oh well, China could get the goods through the penguin island and then blah 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 blah.
So again, if you're listening to this podcast while you're working out or driving and you're not in finance, and this is who this is for, we want to make sure that that's our audience here. Look, let me just explain something. This is really important. Due process is important because that's why the dollar is so. The dollar isn't the reserve currency because America's got nukes and aircraft carriers and yeah, America, baby, let's go. No, that's not why. It's because when you're a foreigner and you buy American stuff, including financial assets like a bond, you just know, man, Americans are not going to mess with that. You're going to have some really good asset managers who know how to do their job, probably wearing some vests, quarter zips. Right? And they're going to just manage these assets for you. They're not going to blow them away. They're not going to gamble them away. They're not going to arbitrarily say you owe us a VIG, So one of the big sort of narratives out there is that there's more coming. That there's going to be an external revenue agency. And so the problem with this is it's arbitrary and it's just made up as President Trump goes along. Now, it's been with tariffs. If I own 100 billion of US treasuries, or in China's case, somewhere between 2 and 3 trillion, am I going to start having to pay taxes on that, which you didn't have to before? And the funny thing about this is it's not even about President Trump. Just to make everyone listening to this try to add some, what is it? Equivocation to this, which I like to do because I just hate everyone as a nihilist. If Scott Bessent had his way, Treasury Secretary, he's a Wall Street guy. He knows what he's doing. I hope he would put a transaction tax of 0.05%. But you're still going to sell that if you're a sovereign wealth fund because you're worried that AOC president is going to love having a lever on financial transactions, and she might jack it up to 5% because that's usually a tool and a lever of the left. Traditionally, it's the left of center sort of thinking and policymaking that encourage to put financial transaction taxes. So just by putting it in, even if the Trump administration says like, hey, listen, rest of the world, don't worry, guys, we're going to put a very small tax, 0.005%. You're not even going to know. Every time you buy and sell a treasury, we're going to take 0.05%. Come on, man. Like, I know for a fact that many sovereign wealth funds are going to say like, nah, we're out, because you just introduced a button. You now have on your control panel, you have a new way to raise revenue, and it's by going after my holdings of what was supposed to be a safe haven asset. The very pillar of American like reserve currency, the dollar, is really based on this, on trust.
Which sort of I was watching appropriately. I was rewatching Margin Call a couple of weeks ago because my wife hadn't seen it, and I'm sure if you haven't seen this movie, you should go to YouTube and see the clip with Jeremy Irons where he's talking about the music stopping. Maybe we can put that clip in here. But the question I was building up to, Marco, because on Friday the dollar was weakening and yields were doing weird stuff, and now the dollar strengthening again and yields are up, and now we're whipsawing. Like it feels like every time I open up the terminal, like things are completely different. But if you haven't seen Margin Call, there's this scene where they realize the subprime mortgage is happening, and Jeremy Irons is the CEO, and he comes in at 3:00 in the morning or whatever it is, and he says, "Why do they pay me the big bucks? It's to listen to the music and to see if the music has stopped or not." And he looks around the boardroom and says, "The music has stopped. Sell everything, liquidate everything. Like I don't hear a thing." And so my question to you is, I think that if we get the off ramp, and I expect the off ramp to come, I think an off ramp is coming. I don't think he's going to stick to this on April 9th. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm giving him too much rational actor credit, and I've done that before. I've been guilty of that before, and maybe I'm making the same mistake. But I think he's going to take the off ramp. My question to you is, let's say he doesn't take the off ramp. Let's say he triples down. Let's say we get the bleach moment. He doubles the tariffs from here, or he does something else with the tariffs. My question to you, for the normal guy who's at the gym right now, who like has maybe 150 in his retirement investment account or his 401k or something like that, is the music about to stop? Is it about to be like Great Depression level drops in equity values for the U.S. stock market if he sticks to this? Because I'm having trouble telling myself a story in which you don't get absolutely massive drawdowns even from here if he triples down. And there is a non-zero part of me, 15%, 20%, that thinks he's going to have the bleach moment, and that like the entire market could just like what we've seen so far isn't even close to what it is yet. Do you have any silver linings for me, or do you want to talk me off the ledge, or do you hear the music stop?
So first of all, if you're listening to this and you're not in finance, you gotta not try to time the markets. Please don't try to time the markets. And certainly we're not going to do that on this podcast. We're just not. This is not really a podcast about markets and finance. We're having this one, I guess, as you said, emergency podcast. That is about that a little bit. But so that's why I would say, like, I'm actually more optimistic, and that's again maybe our fault because we are cousins effectively. I think that he will walk off the ledge, but I would not encourage anyone to buy. And I personally like didn't, right? So like in my own research over the last 3 weeks, I've been flagging that there is, I think, a high probability, this is all negotiations, he's going to go through his 7 steps of maximum pressure, but we are in step 1 and there's 7 of them. So, there's no need to be a hero here. Be 10, 15% late into the market. Like, it's fine. It's not. So that's why, like, the odds that we get let them drink bleach moment, which should be the title of this podcast, I think, let them drink bleach.
Yep.
Like the odds of that are, pretty high. So if you're just trying to preserve your capital, like, why would you try to be a hero and buy back right now?
Well, but that's why I brought up the Jeremy Irons Margin Call thing, because I agree with you there, and you shouldn't try to time the market. But should you sell? Should you get out now with what you have because we're about to get a 50% drawdown? Like, I don't think that's the base case, but I'm telling you that 10 to 15% of me is Jeremy Irons in that movie and is thinking, if we get the let them eat bleach moment, is it 2000 for like how far are we going to go? Like, I think that could be a real fear.
I think that's highly unlikely. So that is highly unlikely. I think going down another like 30% from here would be, like impeachment, like would be like just nobody, like it would be so low, people would start buying because it's like, bro, like he's out. These policies are. By the way, you know what? Like I've said this before. He if you're pro tariffs, if you're like Robert Lighthizer, like sitting in your armchair right now, smoking a pipe or whatever Robert Lighthizer does on his time off, but like you're like, and you're pro tariffs, you're like, tariffs are good. You're probably pissed off because this man is about to ruin tariffs for the rest of humanity. You know what I mean? Like this will sear in the memory of America that tariffs are dumb. Even though like they're not. Like they're you can defend tariffs. There's ways to defend tariffs. Not all trade should be free and fair. Whatever. Like my point is just that if we go down another 30%, there's a self-corrective mechanism here where it's like, nah, like that's just unlikely.
Can you put a number on unlikely for me?
I mean, I don't know. Like, again, that's not what the podcast is really about. So, I would rather not and leave it mysterious. But, I think,
International man of mystery.
no, listen,
Look at him dancing around. No, but the reason I wanted to have an emergency podcast was because I actually think that this has become so ingrained in the zeitgeist that I think every normal average person is waking up and being like, what the F is this?
Look, I think it's less than 5%. We go down another 30%. Then we lose another third of the market. I think that's unlikely. And I think it's unlikely because, again, there's so many constraints. We didn't even talk about all of them. We talked about 3 of them. But there is another one, which is just politics. And so if you look at the primary schedule, everybody's obsessed about November 2026, the midterms. That's not what you should be focused on. You should be focusing on primaries right now. If you're a member of the House of Representatives, if you're a member of the Senate, it's not about your Democratic challengers you care about. It's that some Republican, some conservative, some veteran, some business owner, some guy owning a used car dealership is going to throw their hat in the ring and say, like, we're done with this. Like, I'm coming in. I'm going to bring back common sense into the Republican Party. And so you're going to face that person off in a couple of months, by the way, because the primaries are in first and second quarter of next year. So you're going to have to deal with advertising, with campaigning, if you're a member of the House, like this summer, like within 3 months. And so that's where the constraint comes in. Members of the House and of the Senate will jump ship if something like this happens.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll close on this and then I'll give you the last word. Because I also don't think the scary thing is going to happen, but I thought we should address markets head on just because, like, for a moment, it was a question in my mind and too big of a question for me to refute it. And I wanted to take your pulse on it. But
30% like is a big number, though, Jacob. That's all I would say. Like another 10%, I would not like. Of course, that can happen. 15% even, but like 30% is, from these levels, that's a 50% drawdown on the stock market.
Well, that's why I'm saying, like, all of the headlines are, this is the highest things have been since Smoot-Hawley. We haven't done this since the Great Depression. Okay, what happened in the Great Depression was equity values basically went down, 70%, whatever it was? Like, if we're talking about this in the headlines, like, that is the thing that people are invoking.
But again, remember my third constraint in the US? We're going to be sitting here, like, holding what in our hands. The rest of the world, like, again, the rest of the world is going to move on. And so what I would say to everyone listening to this podcast is what I told everyone that I talked to over the last 12 months is take your US dollars and go shopping. Go shopping in the rest of the world. So if you want to avoid that kind of an outcome, the rest of the world is going to recalibrate. There's going to be stimulus across the rest of the world. They're going to do right things. And all that's going to happen is our assets are going to decline more. So that's what I would say. That's kind of how you can prevent yourself from the Smoot-Hawley. But by the way, Smoot-Hawley led to the Great Depression because everybody else did it too, right? Again, that's the big danger here, that this is different from the 30s, is that we're the only ones, the US is the only one that's losing its mind. And you can't even point to World War I. Like, why are we losing our mind? Because we decided to invade Iraq and Afghanistan? Like,
yeah. Well, anyway, so closing thoughts are, I wanted to get this out there because I was feeling a little bit shifty myself. But if you actually look at the news flow beneath the headlines about Smoot-Hawley and the Great Depression and oh my God, there's actually some nice stuff. There's some multipolar things like, hey, the EU and India, maybe this is going to be the thing that pushes them across the finish line for a free trade deal they've been arguing about for over 10 years. You had Iranian-backed militias in Iraq come out today, Monday, April 7th, and say, we're ready to disarm. If there's part of a US-Iran nuclear deal, like we're ready to go. So you've got informal Iranian talks. Maybe there's going to be a new Iran deal. You had the People's Daily come out and say the sky is not going to fall. And literally the door is not closed to negotiations. So even as there's all of this back and forth between Trump and China retaliatory tariffs, the People's Daily is telling you the door is not closed. We are open for negotiations. None of this is set in stone yet. So to your point, like everybody talking and negotiating. And President Trump had a phone call with Prime Minister Ishiba from Japan, and they agreed to set up a cabinet level tariff negotiation group where they're going to go back and forth and talk about these tariffs and continue. So that's aside from Vietnam and some of these others, even Japan sort of playing ball. So if you start like taking apart all of the drama and looking at what actually is happening, there's a lot of the multipolar geopolitics. There's the Iran stuff that we've been talking about. There's countries that are open to making deals. Like maybe all of these things are going to come together. But I would just put to you that if he doesn't take some kind of off ramp on April 9th, that doesn't have to be the elimination of all the tariffs. But if he does let them drink bleach in this market and with countries in this particular way, I do think it might snowball and avalanche and get beyond him. I think he's on a very precarious level. I think he's taking it just about as far as he can go. And maybe he's the businessman. Maybe he knows better than me and he can take it further. And I'm just a pussy because I wouldn't know what to do. But I feel like he's right on the edge of something because if he pushes it any further, I feel like things get very dark. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, no real arguments against that. I think it was interesting that you were mentioning geopolitics. I think geopolitics is another way in which, there's a constraint. Like you do need the rest of the world to cooperate on a bunch of things. So I think you're right. Like I said, as I was driving last night for 3 hours, I kept thinking of this off ramp concept, and I got very detailed about it. Like we're in a car right now. There's two off ramps, like in succession, like 5 miles from here, and another one 10 miles. And then there's a sign that says no off ramp for like 100 miles. Make a U-turn right here. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's why I use that analogy because I think it's perfect, and I'm glad we agree on that.
Well, I stole that concept from David McWilliams, the former Irish central banker who has a pretty good podcast of his own. And he was talking once about Ireland and the Irish central bank in the context of the 2008 financial crisis and talking about how the job of central bankers and most like big policy officials, you can't prevent the crisis, but you're just kicking the can as far as you can for the double pun there. Like you just are trying to create more time because eventually the crisis is going to come. But how much time can you create between when the crisis comes and not? And that's most of what policy is. And the interesting thing from like an academic or intellectual point of view is that President Trump is like, screw that. Let's bring the crisis to now. Let's start it. I'm not trying to create any room. I'm trying to expedite this and accelerate it and get it as quickly as possible, which is basically anathema for policymakers and politicians. They're almost like genetically designed to kick the can down the road to the next administration. And he's not doing that. He's trying to bring the crisis right to now. And we'll see if it's the right decision.
Well, you said you wanted to give me the last word, and I just want to do one of these tortured analogies that 0.7% of our fans are going to like.
Great.
If that's okay. And I want to make the case that Kevin Durant is a MAGA fan. So let me give you a quote he gave about international basketball. Okay, he was asked, whether the gap between America and the rest of the world was narrowing, given the fact that they barely beat Serbia in the semifinals, and he goes to say, "Hell no, of course not. We beat Serbia 3 times this summer. One game." Yeah, they're going to get one game when they look solid. France beat us one time, then we beat them for the gold. We created basketball. They were influenced by us. Luka was influenced by Americans. So is Jokic. So was Tony Kukoc. So was Manu Ginobili. Tony Parker. All these dudes were influenced by Americans. We set the blueprint. It's cute for sure for people who want to experience history. I was there to see the changing of the guard. People want to try to switch the narrative and hype some shit up when the reality is that we've been dominating these dudes the whole time. And they finally got close to 20 points, and now you're saying they're catching up? Now it doesn't make any sense. The best players come from the places we come from. We set the standard for being great in basketball. There's going to be some players like Victor, Jokic, Giannis. I don't want to put Shea in there because Canada's next door. Hashtag 51st state. If you want to look at three players, and say that they caught up to the rest of Americans, you can't just use three players to make that claim, to say that they start catching up now, or because of one game against Serbia. I don't believe it's close. They can't compete. So why am I bringing this up? I bring this up because it's this like front-running attitude. The only reason, KD, you have a gold medal from Paris is because you got Joel Embiid to have 5 minutes, best game of his life. The United States of America needed to basically get an import player to guard Jokic, who was going to decimate you. All right? Like, what were you going to guard him yourself, Katie? You weigh as much as his thigh, one of them. So, like, let's just be very clear here. Let's just be very real. U.S. has a gold medal because Joel Embiid, who's Cameroonian French guy, decided to get a gold medal and had 5 minutes of his life. By the way, those 5 minutes against Serbia in the semifinal game will define Joel Embiid's career because he's never going to do anything else. So what am I getting at? Why am I bringing this up? I bring this up because it's this like very callous, like there is no competition. It's this front-running attitude. And the reason I mention this is because hiding behind tariffs against competition, I don't know what happens in the next 12 I don't know what happens in the next 12 hours. I don't know what happens with, markets in the next 2 weeks. But I have a pretty high conviction view of what's going to happen in the next 5 years. Because it's this like attitude that, oh, well, we're number one. We don't need to compete with the rest of the world. We're just going to put up trade barriers. And we're going to import Joel Embiid. And we're going to beat Serbia. So we're the greatest because we invented basketball. So the end of discussion. Meanwhile, we haven't had, to extend the analogy, an American MVP since like 2018, James Harden. By the way, the fact that he's the last American MVP just like washes with so much awesome thoughts. And I think that what KD really expressed in that monologue when he went off on how the rest of the world can't compete with America because America invented basketball 150 years ago, like, okay, is I think actually what's entrenched in the White House as well right now. It's like, if we just put up barriers against the rest of the world, we're going to be fine. But actually, the U.S. will not be fine. The U.S. will end up looking like it did in the 70s and 80s, where they produce gas guzzling machines that nobody wants to buy, and the rest of the world like moves on to a new technology that's actually better. And so this is the worst thing that could happen to the U.S. in the long term. Instead, it should embrace competition, and it should use that competition to get better domestically. Yeah, with some targeted industrial policy, obviously. Nothing is 1 or a 0. It doesn't have to be completely free trade, and it doesn't have to be completely non-free trade. You want some of that Chinese technology for how to build EVs cheaply, then invite them. Force them to do JVs like they did to the West. Tell BYD you can build and operate a plant in Ohio if it's run with GM. Teach our engineers how to build this. There's all sorts of ways in which competition and trade can lead to innovation. But putting up trade barriers, it's not going to be it. And you're basically going to sound like old man Katie who can't get the Suns into the playoffs. You know what I mean? So, all right, there you go.
So, moral of the story, please share Geopolitical Cousins with everyone that you possibly know, because where else are you going to get a Kevin Durant, Donald Trump extended tortured analogy? Nowhere else in the world are you going to get that. I would venture to say that.
Front running. Don't like it.
All right. Well, us blog boys or podcast boys or whatever KD would call us, we're going to get out of here and get to our real jobs. But thank y'all.